sure you might have heard of someone called Dracula. Now, he's actually based off a real person, a man called Vlad III Dracula. The throne becomes too much for Sultan Murad II. He decides that he's going to leave the throne and appoint his 9-year-old son, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, as the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, Europe sees this as a chance. A 9-year-old boy on the throne. You have to make sure that you are very, very strong and that you don't make mistakes. He was one of the tutors, military tutors and political tutors of Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. Candarli Halil Pasha was against the siege right from the beginning. Before they even marched out to Constantinople, he had this long ambition and long time dream that we want to conquer Rome. He saw how many thousands of Muslims died in that siege. The Ottomans, they used to just behave like a beylik, like a principality, a small tribe. Really, his grandson Sultan Selim I and Sultan Suleiman I, who now usher in a golden age of the Ottoman Empire.
إنهم فتية آمنوا بربهم وزدناهم هدى.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So today we're here to continue with the story of Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. We started off last week, or 2 weeks ago actually, by speaking about the early parts of his life and the conquest of Constantinople. Just briefly to recap who he was before we continue with the story today. So Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, we spoke 2 weeks ago about the birth of the Ottoman Empire, a small Turkic tribe, a principality, a beylik that started off in Western Anatolia, so modern day Turkey in the western parts. And they grew with Sultan Osman I, their founder. He had a dream where a tree grew out of his chest and the branches of this tree covered the entire world. And so when he spoke to his teacher about what this dream meant, his teacher told him that he and his ancestors would be given sultanate and they would be given custodianship of the world, and they would establish an empire that would rule over so many parts of the world, and they would provide shade and justice to oppress people all around the world. And so in that spirit, Sultan Osman I, Osman Ghazi, and his son Orhan and their grandsons, they expanded the empire over the next 100 years or so into many, many different parts of Europe and Asia. And then finally, the 7th Ottoman Sultan, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, comes to the throne. Firstly, we said in 1440, around that time, 1443, where his father Murad II, he had fought so many battles and so many wars, and not only wars with the Christians and foreign powers, but also wars in his own mind and with his own heart, because his own wife died, his own son died, and whilst fighting so many battles and dealing with all of these internal difficulties, psychological difficulties, the throne becomes too much, sultanate becomes too much for Sultan Murad II, and so he decides that he's going to leave the throne and appoint his 9-year-old son, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, as the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. But obviously, Europe sees this as a chance. A 9-year-old boy on the throne, this was their chance to invade the Ottoman Empire. And so a crusade was launched, and Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih very famously wrote a letter to his father asking him to come back and defeat this crusade. And that's exactly what his father does. But then about 2 years later, internal strife and difficulties take over in the Ottoman Empire. They're on the brink of civil war. And so Sultan Murad II, who'd retired from the throne, had come back to try and sort of deal with these troubles. He sent Mohamed Al Fatih away from the throne to a distant province to rule there whilst he deals with the troubles in his own empire. And so a few years later, in 1451, Sultan Murad II passes away, and Mohamed Al Fatih now becomes the 7th Ottoman Sultan of the empire. And straight away, he sets his sights on the ancient and famous city of Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire. And after 6 weeks of a long, grueling siege, where so many times his armies were pushed back, his ministers tell him that you need to return, you need to turn back, you need to give up on this siege. This is a dream. We're not going to be able to conquer Constantinople. You will destroy your army and will destroy the Ottoman Empire in trying to do so. He doesn't give up. He goes on. His teachers continue to tell him, no, you can't do it. And then finally, in late May of 1453, Ottoman armies pour through the gates of Constantinople. The flags of Islam and the Ottoman Empire are planted atop the walls of Constantinople. And just like that, an era was over. An era in the world that had lasted for over 1,000 years was over. The Roman Empire the last bastion of Roman civilization, Constantinople, its capital city, had finally been conquered and now belongs to the Muslims and belongs to the Ottomans. Its massive cathedral, the Hagia Sophia, which was one of the largest cathedrals of Christian Europe, that had been converted into a masjid. And that is where we left off 2 weeks ago, where we spoke about the life of Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. So now we continue with the rest of his life. And the thing is, a lot of people, they think that, that's sort of the only thing he did. That's what they know about him mainly, that he conquered this grand city. But really, he rules for at least another 30 years. Around another 30 years, he rules the Ottoman Empire for. And he achieves a lot of things. He does a lot of things during these 30 years. Inshallah, that's going to be the focus of what we're going to go through today. So as we've said, as soon as he conquers Constantinople, it was the end of an era. And a new era began, not only for the Muslims, but for the entire world. The world was heading for a new era that would once again, just like 400-500 years ago, when it was dominated by the Umayyads and the Abbasids, the world would once again be dominated by the Muslims. But not your ordinary, not Muslims who came from the heartlands of Islam, from Hijaz or from Syria. Muslims had come all the way from Central Asia and migrated to Turkey. These would now be the people that would spearhead the next few centuries of Islamic civilization. And so the first thing he does after he conquers Constantinople, and because this is the main thing that I want us to understand, that this is the start of a new era. And the first thing he does, Mohamed Al Fatih, is he settles old accounts. There were certain people, and by this, there's one very specific individual who right from the get-go had been against the siege of Constantinople. Who was this man? This was the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. Now, Grand Vizier, what we mean by that is he's like the right-hand man of the Sultan, the second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. He's just below the Sultan. So whilst the Sultan obviously will deal with a lot of things, he can't do everything in the empire. A lot of things he will delegate to the Grand Vizier. So he was the second most powerful man, answerable only to the Sultan himself. And this person, his name, the person who had this position, was Candarli Halil Pasha. And Candarli Halil Pasha was against the siege right from the beginning. Before they even marched out to Constantinople, right from the beginning, he was telling Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih that don't go on this siege. I don't think you can do this. And even when the siege started, he kept telling him that you need to turn back, you need to turn back. And after the conquest of Constantinople, rumors began to spread that Candarli Halil Pasha had been taking bribes from the Romans. And because of these bribes, he was accused of being a traitor, and in the end, he was executed. And so that's what we mean by settling old accounts. Now, was he actually a traitor or not? This is a point of huge speculation. There's many reasons why we think that he could have been killed, aside from just being accused of taking bribes. Some say that those bribes weren't actually bribes, they were just an exchange of gifts. Remember, he's a very high-ranking minister, high-ranking state official. We know that it's customary when high-ranking state officials and dignitaries meet each other from different states, they exchange gifts. So some say this was actually an exchanging of gifts. Now, one of the more plausible reasons that Candarli Halil Pasha was executed is because he had become very, very powerful to the point where now he could challenge the authority of Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. And Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, he didn't like that, because authority should belong to the Sultan. It will cause instability. It will cause problems in the empire if other people rise up to power. And the fact that he had become very powerful, the fact that he was against the siege, and the fact that there were now rumors that he had taken bribes, all of this led to his execution. Another really important thing is that Candarli Halil Pasha, he was what we can say the old guard. He was a very, very cautious man. Remember, he fought in so many wars. Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih's father laid siege to Constantinople a couple decades before that, and they failed. And Candarli Halil Pasha saw that. He saw how many thousands of Muslims died in that siege. He didn't want that to happen again. He didn't want innocent Muslims. He didn't want Muslims to be killed for no reason, for a crazy dream that could never come true. And so he was sort of a very, very cautious man. And Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, he couldn't have that. He was a man who was very ambitious. He was very young as well. He was very ambitious. He wanted to conquer so many different countries. He wanted to make the Ottoman Empire the most powerful empire to ever exist, to replace the Roman Empire, to replace the old Arab Khilafas. But to do that, he couldn't have a man who kept telling him, no, you can't go on this campaign, you can't go on that campaign. He needed someone that was going to, be with him and believe in his dreams and believe in his ambitions and be just as ambitious and as courageous as he was. And so because he was very cautious, Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih knew that he can't continue with Candarli Halil Pasha as his vizier, as his grand vizier. And you can't just exile a man like Candarli Halil Pasha. A man like Candarli Halil Pasha is very powerful. The army respects him. Just like we said, he was a man who grew so powerful because another reason he was so powerful is because his father and his grandfather, Candarli Halil Pasha, his ancestors, they actually were also grand viziers. And so they were a rival aristocratic family. So they're very, very powerful. And Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih couldn't have that. And he needed to and you can't just exile a man like Candarli Halil Pasha. He's too powerful. If you exile him, the army supports him. They'll force the Sultan to bring him back. If not, they'll tell the Sultan, we'll kick you off the throne if you don't bring him back as the Grand Vizier. So he knew the only option to progress the empire, to make sure that there's no instability, is the execution of Candarli Halil Pasha. So straight after the siege, he takes all of this into account and Candarli Halil Pasha was executed. And more likely than not, Candarli Halil Pasha, and I want to also spend a bit of time focusing on this because if you read into his life, Candarli Halil Pasha was a great statesman. And he deserves, some respect and some credit. And a lot of historians will say, and more partial to agreeing with this, he wasn't really a traitor. Because how can a man who spent 20, 30 years fighting and bleeding for Islam, for the Ottoman Empire, building the state, suddenly one day decide that I'm going to start taking bribes from the non-Muslims, from the Romans, from the arch enemies of the Ottoman Empire? Maybe he didn't like the Sultan. Maybe he didn't agree with him. But these were just political disagreements, military disagreements. He could have spoken to the Sultan. He could have even replaced the Sultan with another Sultan if he wanted. He could have become the Sultan himself if he wanted. Why on earth would he take bribes from the Romans? It doesn't make much sense. So because of that, I don't believe that he was a traitor, but this was more just, a disagreement between the two, and all the other reasons we said, all of this led to his eventual execution. Now, who does he replace? Who gets replaced by who does Candarli Halil Pasha replace? Now, there was another man in Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih's court. He was one of the tutors, military tutors and political tutors of Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih. His name was Zaganos Pasha. And he was one of the main sort of commanders in the siege of Constantinople. Without his support, maybe the siege might not have been a success. He was a vehement supporter of Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih. Every time there was a difficulty, he was the first one to try and help him when he came to the siege. He was one of the main sort of military commanders. Some say he was actually the naval commander. So the attack on the sea walls of Constantinople, which we spoke about 2 weeks ago, and how Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih cut down an entire forest and had ships, he made these the logs from the trees, he greased them, and then he had the ships carried over by hand over these logs and dropped into the sea. One of the people that made sure this vision and this idea came true was Zaganos Pasha. So obviously the Sultan trusted him a lot, and he was now the new Grand Vizier, and he was obviously the man who Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih wanted, because they both had the same goals and same ambitions. And so now that the new Grand Vizier is in place, the government is stable once again. The Ottoman war machine was now being prepared for the next campaign, the next war. And Christian Europe, they held their breath, waiting to see who would be the next person to fall to Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih's sword. Everyone was just sort of raising their hands to the sky, praying that the Ottoman army doesn't come to their country or their state next. But who was the next person that Sultan, or the next sort of state that Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih went to war with? That was the country of Serbia, or the state of Serbia. Now, Serbia, they were a vassal state to the Ottoman Empire. And what we mean by a vassal state is that the ruler, the lord of this empire, of this country, they can maintain their status as the lord, as the ruler, but their overlord now becomes whoever they are a vassal to. So in this case, the Ottoman Sultan. They will pay yearly taxes to him. If the Sultan asks for soldiers, they have to give them soldiers. Sort of their foreign policy is under the control of whoever they are a vassal to, so the Ottoman Sultan. But they can keep their own laws, they can keep their own practices and things like that. They can keep their position as well. But their foreign policy is sort of under the control of the Sultan. So Serbia was a vassal state, and they would pay the yearly taxes as usual, no problem. But the problem was, they sometimes became treacherous. And Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih knew that if Serbia was not under the firm control of the Ottomans, he could not conquer Europe because of Serbia's geographic location. If the Ottomans were to go to campaign in Central Europe and the Serbians betrayed them, then this would cause a huge problem for the Ottomans. The back of their army could get attacked. And so the Serbians are known to be quite treacherous. So Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, he took his army with Zanos Pasha and they went to campaign in Serbia. He didn't conquer the land, he won a military victory and he ensured that a new peace treaty was signed. It was a show of force that, listen, if you dare to attack us or betray the terms of this treaty, we will conquer you and we will destroy your empire. So it was more a sign or a show of force to ensure that the Serbians remained in line. And so with Serbia secure, now Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih was ready for his conquest of Central Europe. But to conquer Central Europe, there's this one key fortress that you need to pass through. There's a key river, and that's the Danube River. To pass the Danube River, to control that, there's a key fortress by the river called Belgrade. So obviously now we know it's a whole city, right? Belgrade in Hungary. But back then it was just a fortress. It was a very, very important fortress, but a very well fortified fortress. So very hard to attack and very hard to take. So Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih in 1456, with Zanos Pasha at the head of the army, and Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih with this campaign, he was more of an oversight. He went with the army and he fought, but a lot of the tasks were delegated to Zaganos Pasha because of how much trust he had in him. But the problem with this was that the siege was not successful. Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih's army, the Ottomans, they push on, and just as it looks like the Hungarians, the army is going to collapse and this fortress will fall to the Ottomans, a final assault is ordered on the walls of Belgrade. But it's at this point that the Hungarians, they put up a fierce resistance and they push back the Ottomans. The Ottoman camp even is attacked. A lot of the cannons are destroyed and a lot of the artillery is destroyed, the gunpowder and things like that. And seeing this, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih orders his army to retreat. Because of this failure, this massive, massive failure, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih dismisses Zaganos Pasha from his role as Grand Vizier and exiles him away. And what happens next, whether he comes back to the Ottoman court ever again, is debated. But what we do know is that he never ever comes back to that position of Grand Vizier ever again. Again, this was a difficult decision for the Sultan because this is a man who was his teacher. Really, he was his teacher that trained him. Conquest of Constantinople, his dream, this might not have ever happened if it wasn't for Zaganos Pasha. But he had to dismiss him because of this massive failure, because of how many soldiers died. We might think that this is a bit, harsh from the Sultan. But you have to imagine, for the Sultan, all the soldiers that die, he is responsible for it, right? So for him, he can't have a military commander who is going to fail in, attacks and cause the death of so many people. So because of that, he dismisses Zaganos Pasha from the position of Grand Vizier. And who is appointed next? So now we've already gone through 2 Grand Viziers. And it's something we see with the Ottoman Sultan. A lot of the time, the Grand Viziers, they change quite frequently because you have to make sure that you are very, very strong and that you don't make mistakes. Because the Sultan will call you to account. The Sultan himself, he expects very high standards of himself and also of his ministers. So if they begin to fail, then they lose favor with the Sultan and they can get dismissed from their position. So the next person is Mahmud Pasha. And Mahmud Pasha was a very, very talented sort of Grand Vizier. He was recruited from what we call the Devshirme system. And that was something that the Ottomans had, a system of recruiting ministers and soldiers into their army. It was basically young boys taken from the Balkans, from Balkan states, the Christian states there, and they would be raised up in the Ottoman court. They would be trained in Ottoman schools, either to join the army or to serve in the Ottoman court as ministers and administrators. And one of those people who came up with that system was Mahmud Pasha, who eventually became the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. And really, the Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha, he lasts for a long time. And he is the backbone of a lot of the successful conquests that Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih has during his reign. The first of which, the next conquest, is the campaign in Maria. So Maria was the sort of last few territories that belonged to the Roman Empire. That was it. That was all that was left of the Roman Empire. Really, the Roman Empire is destroyed when Constantinople is conquered. But these were some small islands that belonged to the Romans, but they were very, very weak. And so Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih orders that a large army, alongside his now new very large and powerful navy, to go and attack these the islands in Maria, and this now falls to the control of the Ottomans. And what was the reason for this? Why was he attacking these islands? It's not just one day he woke up and decided, let me attack these islands. Obviously, he's Sultan, right? He had ambitions, he had goals. The goal was that these were some islands that were in the sea, and the Ottomans needed control of the sea to control trade, to ensure that the seas were safe, that there wasn't any raids from pirates and things like that. So he needed control of these islands. And so that was one of the reasons that he goes and attacks Myria to take control of these islands. The next conquest is the conquest of Trabzon. Now, this was a very interesting story. You find this mainly in the Ottoman accounts. The Western accounts don't really mention this story. We know that the conquest of Trabzon does happen, but exactly what happens in this next part I'm going to say, this is a bit contested, but we know that the Ottoman accounts do speak about this story. So what happens is, Trabzon is also a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. They pay taxes, they give their soldiers when the Sultan needs them. But one day, a messenger from the court from Trabzon arrives at the Ottoman court, and he tells Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih that the emperor of Trabzon wants to inform you that he will no longer pay taxes to the Ottomans. And all the previous taxes that he paid last year and the year before and the year before that, he wants them to be paid back. So Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, when he hears this, he smiles. And he says, go tell your emperor that he will no longer need to pay taxes to the Ottomans. And as for all the previous taxes that he once repaid, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih himself will come and give those taxes back. And the following year, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, with a large army, goes out of Constantinople and conquers Trabzon. And so that was how the empire of Trabzon fell. Again, this is something that shows that if you're going to go and talk to Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, you better watch your words, basically. He's not a man that is to be trifled with. He's not a man that when you go to his court, you make empty threats, because he's not someone who's going to make empty threats. He's not a man to waste time. If you're going to make a threat to him, you better be prepared to carry out, because he was, as soon as he got a whiff of rebellion from the emperor of Trabzon, straight away he marched out with his army. He wouldn't take this insult. So he marched out with his army and he conquered Trabzon. And so another great and famous empire and famous state now fell to the Ottomans. So you can see again how this idea of a new era is beginning, right? All these ancient and famous empires, the Roman Empire, now the empire of Trabzon, all of these are now beginning to fall to the Ottomans. And this new era is beginning that will be dominated by the Muslims and by the Ottomans. And now then the next really important part during his life is the campaign in Wallachia. Now this was a very significant campaign. Sure, you might have heard of someone called, you might have heard movies or stories in fiction about Dracula, right? Now he's actually based off a real person. And this was the person that Mohamed Al Fatih went to war with. And this is really who the story comes from. A man called Vlad III Dracula. That was the title that was given to him, or Vlad the Impaler. And so Mohamed Al Fatih goes to war with him. Now, how does this war start? Where does it come from? Wallachia was basically, or some people pronounce it Wallachia, however you want to pronounce it, they were another vassal state to the Ottomans. So because a lot of these states were vassals and they sort of tried to rebel against the Ottomans. So this story actually starts during the time of Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih's father. So Wallachia was a vassal state to Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih's father, Sultan Murad II. But they rebel. Vlad II. So Vlad II, the father, he rebels against Sultan Murad II. So Sultan Murad II marches out with his army and he destroys Vlad's army. And when Vlad is brought in front of the Sultan, he begs for mercy. And he promises, I will never rebel again. Let me go back to my throne. And what does Sultan Murad II say? He says, I can't trust you. How do I know that you're not going to rebel again? The minute I let you go back, how do I know you won't gather Christian armies against me and march again? Do you have anything that can guarantee me your loyalty? So what is agreed now after that request, that can you guarantee me your loyalty in any way? So Vlad II's two sons, Radu and Vlad III, they are to be taken as wards of Sultan Murad II. They will be taken back to the Ottoman Empire and they will be raised in the Ottoman court. And if Vlad II ever dares to rebel again, then the heads of his two sons, Vlad III and Radu, will be chopped off and sent to Vlad II. So these sons were kept sort of as hostages. But obviously, it's not like they were treated badly. They were treated very, very well. They were raised up with Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, actually. They were trained in Ottoman practices in the Ottoman court. So they were treated very well, given a very good education. Just like the prince, or Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, one of the prince, just like he received. They had similar teachers as well. So they were treated well, but this was to guarantee the safety or to guarantee the loyalty of Vlad II. And so obviously, as Murad II passes away and Vlad II also passes away. Now, Vlad II has passed away, and a new person needs to be sent to rule over Wallachia, right? Because the old person has passed away. And at this time, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih is the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. So who does he dispatch? He can send two. He can either send Radu or he can send Vlad III. And he sees that Vlad III is a bit more trained in politics and governance, so he'd be better to rule. So he sends Vlad III to rule as the voivode of Wallachia, meaning, you'll be the ruler, but you're a vassal to us. So he goes to rule like that. But then shortly after Vlad, he begins to stop paying his taxes. And some reports say Mohamed Al Fatih, initially he ignores this. Because remember, Vlad III was like a brother to him because they were raised up together. So he doesn't, he's trying to think of some good reasons. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he'll just pay it next year in double, whatever. It's fine, let's leave it. But this becomes repetitive. He constantly refuses to pay taxes. So now Mohamed Al Fatih, he has to put his emotions to one side. He can't think and act like Mohamed Al Fatih. He has to behave and act like the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. So he sends messengers to Vlad III, and the messengers ask him, why are you not paying your taxes? What does Vlad III do? There's two reports of what he does. Number one is that the turbans that the Ottoman messengers were wearing, he nails them to their heads. So he gets a nail, and like for example, if you want to screw something into someone's head, he nails them to their heads. The second account, and this is much more, graphic and much more vivid what he does, but he is known for doing this because one of his he was given a title based off this thing that he used to do. What was the thing that he used to do? He used to impale people. So some of the accounts say he impaled the messengers. Now, what does impaling mean? Impaling means that you get a large wooden log from a tree, and you will basically put this up from a person's backside, and it would come out their chest, and they would basically so imagine you sort of, and then after you sort of put up from the back of their body all the way to come out of their chest, this sort of log that you have would now be digged into the ground, so the person would just be there sort of on top of the log, with the log coming out of their chest, just on the street. And if you had like a specialist, you had like specialist impalers basically. If you had a specialist, what he would do, someone who's very trained in that, what he would do is he would miss all the vital organs when you're getting impaled. So you would sort of just be sticking on that log, but you would die very, very slowly because your blood is not draining out very fast. Obviously, if you hit the vital organs, then your blood drains out very quickly, your kidneys and your lungs. And if these collapse, you die very quickly. But a specialist, he would miss all of these. He would make sure that, it comes out of your chest in a way that it misses all these organs. And then you would die very, very slowly. So the other account is that he actually impaled the messengers. And when Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih hears about this, he's enraged. He's not going to allow such an insult to ever, go unaccounted for, unpunished. So he marches out with an army in 1462. And this is one of the largest armies the Ottomans ever assembled in their history in that time. About 80,000 soldiers, they say, he marched out with to go and defeat Vlad. And so he marches out to Wallachia in the summer or sort of the spring of 1462. And as he's encamped out in Wallachia, his army sort of camps there for the night. Vlad III, he refused a pitched battle. He knows a pitched battle that if him and his army, he tries to meet with Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih's army in an open field, in a pitched battle, they would lose. His army is no match for the cannons of Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, for his well-trained soldiers. Like we said 2 weeks ago, the Ottomans had a specialized unit called the Janissaries. These were men that were trained from a very young age to fight. They were arguably one of the greatest, if not then the greatest and most skilled army unit to ever walk on the face of this earth. They were the Sultan's sort of personal guard, what the Sultan relied on so much. And so Vlad III, he knew there is no way that my army can defeat Mohamed Al Fatih's army. So he was smart. So he would sort of do hit and run tactics, guerrilla warfare. And one of the things he did when Mohamed Al Fatih's army was encamped outside in Wallachia for one night, he launches a night attack. And this is something, this is like a horror story, literally out of a horror story. So he gets soldiers, normally his normal soldiers attack, but also at the same time, soldiers who have the plague, right? And they have spots all over their face and stuff like that. They have disease and they're not really in the right state of mind. He also orders them to run into the Ottoman army, into the middle of their camp. So imagine the Ottomans are just camped for the night and they see these like sort of zombie-like figures running into the Ottoman camp, and a massive cavalry charge, shouting and screaming, arrows being shot with fire into their camp. It terrifies the soldiers. And so he leads this attack. And what was his goal? His goal was that amidst all this chaos, some soldiers, specialized soldiers, are going to go into the Sultan's tent and kill him. And if they can assassinate him there, that's it. We've won the war. Because if the Sultan dies, they're going to take a long time to recover from that. As of yet, only one Sultan has sort of been defeated in the battlefield and been captured and killed. No Sultan in the Ottoman Empire, apart from one, that has happened to. So the Ottoman Empire will collapse because this is still a very new empire, still a very new state. It's not even been 200 years since they've been established, right? So he does that. And they nearly reach the tent of Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. However, that specialized unit we spoke about, the Janissaries, they fight very bravely near the tent of Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. They ferociously defend the Sultan's tent and they push back this attack and they save the Sultan from being assassinated. And so the attack is stopped, the attack is sort of defeated, pushed back, and they can now regroup and try to figure out what on earth just happened. But before they can even, sort of regroup, the next morning when they continue to march out, before they've even gathered their thoughts properly, as they slowly begin to march, they see before them a forest and a long line of 20,000 people, war prisoners, normal, traders, men, women, elderly, regardless. There's no distinction between the people here. 20,000 of them impaled and lined up on one long road. And now you have to imagine the soldiers who just seen that at night time, in the morning, the very next morning, now they are sort of confronted with this apocalyptic sight of 20,000 people lined up, impaled, and the stench of the bodies is so much for the soldiers. This is something that haunts them for the rest of their life. Even the great Sultan himself, Mohamed Al Fatih, who's seen so much, been through so much, even he is taken aback. Some of the accounts say that the Sultan, he sees this and he admits that, how can I conquer a man who does things like this? How can I defeat a man? He begins to question his own resolve. How can I defeat a man who does something like this? 20,000 people impaled and lined up, and most of them hadn't died yet. Right, some of them had died, so the stench was there. But a lot of them were still, bleeding out and still dying. So it was a very apocalyptic sight for the Ottoman soldiers, something that haunted them for the rest of their lives. But regardless, Mohamed Al Fatih did not give up. He knew that this was 20,000 Muslims who'd been killed. And it's hurt me and I don't know what to do, I can't stop. I need to get their revenge. I need to ensure justice is done on this man. And the Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula, the Vlad III Dracula. And so he continues his advance. And Mohamed Al Fatih was also a very political genius, right? He was not just a military genius, but also politically he was incredibly intelligent. So, very, very intelligent. What he does is, remember we said Vlad II had two sons, right? Vlad III and Radu. So Vlad III was sent to rule, but obviously now he's rebelled. So what does Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih do? He calls for Radu to come, and he says, Radu, you are now officially the ruler of Wallachia, and you are now my vassal, basically. You are the voivode of Wallachia. So now the people, the nobles that were around Vlad, the nobles from Wallachia, the lords who had supported Vlad III, now they have to make a decision. Do we side with Vlad III, who we are terrified of, or do we side with Mohamed Al Fatih and Radu, because we know that Mohamed Al Fatih in the end will eventually win. His armies are very, very powerful. This is a man who's not going to be defeated. Eventually he will win. So what do we do? Do we side with Vlad III, or do we side with Mohamed Al Fatih? And in the end, a lot of them defect to Mohamed Al Fatih's side and they back Radu. And now politically isolated, and obviously his military is no match for the Ottomans. When the capital of Wallachia, Dragovista, was being besieged, the Vlad III, he flees, he runs away to Hungary, and Wallachia is conquered once again by the Ottomans, and Radu is placed now as the voivode of Wallachia. And many, many years later, Vlad, he runs away, but many years later, about at least 10, 15 years later, he is finally captured and killed, and his head is presented to Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih in Constantinople. And so that's the end of another really brutal campaign that the Ottomans go on. But again, it's not over. Right now, it's only been 8 years since the conquest of Constantinople. He still lives for another 15 years or so, right? So he goes on so many more campaigns. He goes on to conquer Venice. Actually, before Venice, he goes on to conquer Bosnia and Albania, both of them. And then he goes to attack Venice. Now, what was Venice? Venice was a major trading power, major naval trading power in the Mediterranean Sea. And so he declares war on them. Venice sort of declares war on them, sorry, because they become alarmed by how quickly Muhammad Al Fatih is expanding, and they think we need to stop him. So they declare war. And although it's not an easy military campaign for Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih, his Grand Vizier, we spoke about, Mahmud Pasha, is very successful against them. For the first part initially, anyways, he's very, very successful, and they defeat the Venetians. But in the end, Mahmud Pasha begins to lose a lot of the wars. And this, coupled with rumors that the death of Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih's son, Mustafa, who was sort of the favorite to take over after Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih passed away, and he was obviously very much like his father. He had shown promising skills to be able to rule. He passes away. And there's rumors that Mahmud Pasha was involved in his death. So with those rumors, the failure of the military campaigns, and the fact that he also is now becoming very, very powerful and he can challenge the Sultan's rule, he is executed. Mahmud Pasha. He's first dismissed and then he is executed. Now, just to sort of understand, why does the Sultan execute these people just because they begin to challenge his rule? It's again, just like we explained, the power, Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih understands that the Ottoman Empire is heading towards a new era and he wants to centralize power with the Sultan. The Sultan is the one who should have power. This is an empire. This is no longer a small Turkic beylik, a principality. This is now an empire, and the Sultan is the one who should be in power. There should be no other rival families. He was a student of history. He saw what happens when there's rival families with the Romans, with the Persians. The empire falls into civil war so many times. That's why there isn't many civil wars between different families. There are civil wars between the sons of the Sultan, but there isn't between other families, between the Sultan's family and another powerful family. Because Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih eliminates all these powerful families to ensure that there's stability within the empire and there isn't any civil wars. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a little bit, inshallah. So the Venetian wars, they continue even after the execution of Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha, and the peace treaty is signed where the Venetians have to pay a lot of money to the Ottomans every year, and where also they give up a lot of islands to the Ottomans. So even though he doesn't defeat them, he achieves the purpose that he wanted to. So that was everything that's happening in the West. So as around, I've only spoken about everything that's happening in Europe. But the Ottomans also have borders in the East. And there's these two powers in the East, or three, but mainly two right now, that continue to pester him. And one of these was a rival Turkic beylik, a principality called the Karamanids. And the Karamanids, they were sort of, when the Ottoman Empire was, we spoke about the Ottomans, right? They were a small Turkic beylik at the beginning, and they had a rival, which was the Karamanids. And the Karamanids would constantly cause trouble to the Ottomans. Initially, they were allies. They had an alliance with Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih. But then Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih finds out that they had been making alliances with the Europeans, and then they would launch a two-front attack, a two-pronged attack, one from the west with the Christians, and from the east with the Karamanids on the Ottomans. And Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih, again, he wasn't going to allow this to happen. So he marches with his army to attack the Karamanids, and he destroys their beylik and he conquers them. And some of the princes, they flee further east to the Akkoyunlus. The Akkoyunlus were another Turkish beylik, and they were very, very powerful. And they helped the Karamanids. And so when Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih heard about this, that they were sheltering the Karamanids and they were helping them and they were going to plan a counterattack with the Ottomans, he writes a really famous letter to the Akkoyunlus. And again, this just shows you, similar to what happened with Trabzon, again, he's not a man to mess around with. So he says to the ruler of the Akkoyunlus, the Sultan, he writes in a letter and he says to him, "Before this, you were saved from my wrath by your mother's request." So last time he wasn't attacked the Akkoyunlus, but one of his aunties reportedly was the mother of Uzun Hassan, the ruler of the Akkoyunlus. And when Sultan Muhammad Fatih wasn't attacked them, his auntie, the mother of Uzun Hassan, said that, just leave him, just let it go this time, please, just forgive him, don't attack us, please. So because of that request, he didn't. But this time, there's no stopping them. He says, "Before this, you were saved from my wrath by your mother's request. We accepted you as having found the right path and forgave you. However, it is forbidden for unbelieving Turkmen like you to claim sultanate and independence in my time. It was because we ignored the pride and grandeur you showed in your land, and even all your power and enthusiasm, that you overcame a few like yourself through violence. Despite this, we are aware that you tortured people by forgetting about my presence and living comfortably under my just will, by sending soldiers to Anatolian cities and then to the Karamanids. That's why we have decided to move in the spring of this year to kill you and destroy your Beylik. Forgiving you is definitely not considered. Don't bother in vain. Do you think that destroying province is the act of a sultan? Our swords must be stained with your blood because you violated our lands without hesitation or fear. Come to the square if you are brave. Don't go from one hole to another. Make your preparations and don't say you weren't informed. So really, he's telling him, my army is going to be here at this time of the year. If you're brave, come and fight me. Don't do these small things where you send another person with an army or you hide around from and do these little raids. If you're brave, my army will be waiting here for you. Come and fight us in the field. That was Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih's threat to him. And so he did. He went and he fought and he was defeated. And they say, as he was retreating, he looked at the Karamanids who he had given shelter to. And he said, why did I ever help you guys? What quarrel did I have with the sons of Osman? If I didn't help you, today they wouldn't be destroying me. It's your fault. I had no problem with them, but because of you, I am now being destroyed. And so Uzun Hassan and his army was destroyed in August of 1473. And the eastern borders were now secure for his empire. And one of the last campaigns he goes on to is in Italy. He had this long ambition and long time dream that we want to conquer Rome. It conquered Constantinople, which was, as he viewed, the first Rome, the first capital of Christendom. Now that that's been conquered, we want to conquer the second one. And there's a very important lesson here from his life that we can learn and we can take on today. That the objective to conquer Constantinople, that was one of the reasons the Ottoman Empire was established. One of the founding objectives of the Ottoman Empire was that we want to conquer Constantinople. And so every Ottoman Sultan, they were building towards that, to conquer Constantinople. And they had that in the back of their mind that they wanted to do it. Why? Because you know the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ, surely you will conquer Constantinople, that the Sultan, the commander, he will be the most wonderful of commanders, the most wonderful of emirs, and the Jaysh, the army, will be the most wonderful of armies. And they wanted to be those who fulfilled that prophecy, and they wanted to be part of those people who had that glad tiding, right? And so that's why Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, one of his titles was Sahibul Bashara, sort of the possessor of those glad tidings, because he was the person who fulfilled that prophecy, right? So a lot of them wanted to conquer Constantinople. That was their founding objective. Now, after it had been conquered, what happened next? Did he now say, oh, we've achieved our objective, that's it, let's relax now? The Ottoman Empire was built to conquer Constantinople, done. But for him, that wasn't the end. Yes, they'd achieved their main objective, but he set a new objective now. His new objective was, we wanted Constantinople because it was the heart of Christendom. It was the most important city in the world. But now, the next target for us is Rome. We want to conquer Rome. And that's a lesson that we can take from that, right? That if you achieved an objective, your main objective in life, I don't know, you want to become a scholar, you want to become a teacher, you want to become an engineer, you want to do this, you want to do that. After you've done that, don't stagnate, don't stop. Don't let that be the end. Set a new objective for yourself. It is not befitting of a believer, of a Muslim, to have achieved something in their life and be content with that and just leave there. At a young age, 21, he'd conquered Constantinople. But he didn't give up. He knew, I still have so much more time. There has to be something else for us to do. There has to be something for my children to do. There has to be something for my grandchildren to do so that the Ottoman Empire can last for centuries. So similarly, in your life, try to have ambitious goals. It is not befitting of a believer to be pessimistic in their goals. You've achieved one thing, now have another lofty goal, now have another ambitious goal, and work towards achieving that. Even if you don't achieve that, right? You want to build an organization, you want to build a school or something, a masjid. Even if you aren't able to achieve that, lay the foundations down, do some work so that someone else can continue after you and do that. Just like that, we're going to talk about this campaign. He doesn't actually manage to conquer Rome. In 1480, with his armies, he lands in Otranto, which is basically a port city in Italy. We know Italy, obviously, to go there, he has to go by sea. So he lands in Otranto, he conquers Otranto, but he wasn't able to follow up and conquer Rome. Now, interesting enough, when he does land in Otranto, and when the Pope himself hears that Mohamed Al Fatih is coming with his army, he runs away from Rome. It's something that doesn't happen in history. The Pope is not going to leave Rome. But when he hears that this man who conquered Constantinople is coming, he runs away. He goes, there's no hope. We're not going to stop him. If he's got his eyes set on Rome, Rome will fall. If he has his eyes set on anywhere in Europe, that place will fall to his sword. So the Pope, he fled from Rome. But look, he wasn't able to conquer Italy, right? And there's so many other lands that he couldn't conquer. Moldavia, he wasn't able to conquer it. Hungary, he wasn't able to conquer it. But what did he do? He weakened them. He went on campaigns, he defeated them, but he knows he can't conquer it, but he weakened them. And what happened afterwards? Within 30, 40 years, his grandsons and his great-grandsons, they go and conquer them very, very easily. The conquest of Hungary by Sultan Suleiman I in the 1520s was so easy for him. Why? Because it had already been weakened by Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. That's another thing. If you can't achieve something in life, still work towards it. Inshallah, we hope that Allah will reward you for having achieved that, because you made azima, like a sincere resolution, a resolute intention you had to try and do this thing, and you work towards it. So we hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for it. And even if you can't, maybe Allah will have mercy and bless you enough that maybe your progeny, or maybe the people that you leave after you, they will be able to achieve what you wanted to achieve. It's something we see in history, and just like we're seeing now with the example of Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih. So a very, very important lesson to learn from him. So that's sort of the main military campaigns that he goes on, and that was the main sort of focus that he had during his time. But there are so many other things he did. So a lot of people, they think that all he did was he went on war and he did this. He spent a lot of time, more time outside his own capital city than inside his own capital city. While a lot of people, if you were that powerful, why would you want to leave the luxuries? Why would you want to go and put your own life at risk? But he spent more time outside, away from his family, away from this beautiful capital city that he has. But he spent more time outside fighting in wars. But whilst he was there were certain times where he was there because his army needed to rest. He needs to rest. Sometimes he felt quite ill, so he needed to rest as well. So when some other things that he did achieve was that he created a centralized a system of law in the Ottoman Empire. The first time this sort of happens in the Ottoman Empire, a sort of a codified system of law. Before this, the Ottomans, they used to just behave like a beylik, like a principality, a small tribe. This city has some laws, that city has some laws, some random city down there has some laws. But with Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih, he saw, we are no longer a small beylik, we are no longer a small principality. We are an empire now, and we are going to become the most powerful empire in the world. We can't behave like this. We need certain systems to ensure that we are behaving accordingly and to ensure that our empire lasts for a long time. One of those things he realized had to be done was a codified system of law. Everywhere in the empire, they had to follow this one system of law. A sort of, it was called a kanuni, the first sort of kanuni that is established in the history of Islam. And then his son and his great-grandson, actually, they developed this a lot, this system of law. And so all the judges now had to follow this one sort of system of law answerable to the Sultan. Another thing he did was the taxation. He created a new system of standardized taxation, meaning everyone had to sort of pay taxes in a certain way. Crime, punishment, all of this was now standardized. And this made it obviously a lot more predictable in terms of how much revenue the empire would have. If the empire doesn't know, okay, from taxes we're going to make this much this year, but have no idea how much we're going to make next year, how can it plan for its military campaigns? How can it plan for its expenditure, the public expenditure it's going to spend on? How can it plan for this if it doesn't know how much tax it's taking? So you can see how he's thinking so many years ahead. He is thinking that we are establishing an empire, and so we have to sort of take these things into account and develop these things. He also codified the position of Shaykh al-Islam. So before this, you had something called the Grand Mufti, or the main judge, the chief judge. So one of the first was Imam Abu Yusuf. He was the Grand Mufti, the Grand Judge, the chief judge of the Abbasid Khilafah in Baghdad. And so he sort of codifies his position more, and he calls it the Shaykh al-Islam. And this was now appointed by the Sultan himself, the chief judge, the chief Islamic figure in the Ottoman Empire. If there was any sort of quarrels that couldn't be resolved by the court, this man could step in and he could fix this. So you can see, again, developing the system of law. Also, people that were in positions of power, if you saw that they weren't good enough, he didn't care who you were, he didn't care who your dad was or which your family you are from. For him, if you can't do the job properly, you're fired. You're going to lose your job. So a lot of people, he got rid of them. All these old officials, he got rid of so many of them because they were incompetent. And he made a system based on merit, meaning if you're good enough, then you will take this position. And he relied heavily on that system we spoke about, the Devshirme system, where they would be recruited in. And remember, these guys would be trained from a very young age to govern and to administer the empire. So this made sure that the empire was obviously being administered much, much better. And he had a very huge focus on education. For him, education, he understood, if you want an empire, we need to make sure the people are educated. So he began this system of state universities. And all across, not just Constantinople, but all across the Ottoman Empire, loads of universities were established, schools and universities, including the famous 8 colleges that he also established. Some of them you can actually still find today. If you go to, I was in Istanbul earlier last month, and you could see one of the universities that he built, and it's very, very beautiful. So he established these universities, and they offered free education, by the way. So they didn't have to pay for education. For him, why should education be expensive? Why should it be restricted to only the people who can afford it? So these were all free. They had specialized, like you know how today we have specialized, people can specialize in certain subjects. All of that stuff existed during his time. People could specialize in religious sciences, rational sciences, like math, science, whatever. He created all these universities. And he also, not only did he make sure they were state funded, but there were certain people, you know, even if it's state funded, they have to come from really far away. They need to find a house. They need to pay for food. He gave scholarships out to people who showed that, you know what, they're serious about their education. He gave them monthly sort of money every month. He gave them free housing, food, making sure that the future of the empire was secure. So you can see a man with a lot of foresight. He is planning for the future. I have around me the most talented ministers, but 50 years later, what's going to happen after I've died? And to make sure the future of my empire is safe. And that's what he did by creating these free systems of education. One of the other really important things is that, see, Constantinople, before he conquered it, it was declining, in serious decline. There was poverty, clean water wasn't accessible, food wasn't accessible, disease was spreading, all these things. People didn't have homes to live in, the walls were broken, there wasn't much schools and things. So he made this massive effort to repopulate the city and build up. For him, Constantinople was going to be the capital of the world. Not just of the Muslim empire, of the Ottoman empire, but of the entire world. Everyone from all over the world should look at Constantinople and say, I want to live there. It should be a bastion of how amazing Muslim civilization is. Show the world that this is what Muslims can achieve. And so he led this massive effort to repopulate Constantinople and rebuild it with schools and universities, places to eat, markets, all these things. And he sent letters all across the empire telling people, please come to Constantinople. People didn't want to come, by the way, to Constantinople. They thought it's a city in ruins. Why would we come? But I told them, let's together rebuild this city and leave a great city behind for our children and for our grandchildren. And so that's exactly what he did. And when he built the grand and famous palace called the Topkapi Palace. So if you can go there today now and still see what it looks like, now it's sort of become a museum. But when you see it, it's this magnificent piece of architecture, a grand palace that's there. And he actually created that. That served as the imperial palace for the Ottoman sultans all the way up until the 1800s. Even today, if you go there, there's some artifacts that belong to the Prophet ﷺ and the companions as well. So the Prophet's sword, the sword belonging to the Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali radiallahu anhum. You can find all these things there as well. And the possessions of the sultans themselves. So you can find all these things there. The other really important thing he does is he looks at Hagia Sophia, the massive cathedral, the cathedral that belongs to the Christians, right? This one is magnificent, it's beautiful. When I saw it, this was my first time I went, and when I saw it, I just stared at it in silence without moving for about 20 minutes just because of how amazing it was. If you just look at it, its architecture is just pure magnificence. You think, how can humans build that? And it wasn't built recently. It was built way before the Ottoman Empire was even thought about. It was built, maybe 500, 600, 700 CE. No, sorry, even before that. Way before that it was built. 1,000 years before the Ottomans even conquered it, this was built. And so you think, how can humans build that? It is just pure magnificence. So he looks at that, he makes that into a masjid. But then he says, it's not enough that we make this into a masjid. Because yes, we've conquered this city, and we've shown that by turning this to a masjid, that we've conquered the capital of Christendom. But we can't boast about this though, really, because this was made by Christians. I want to build something that was built by Muslims and something that we can say that this is something that we built. So he orders for a new masjid to be built that's even more beautiful and even bigger and even grander than the Hagia Sophia. And so this masjid is called the Fatih Masjid. You can still find this in Istanbul today. But what happens is he passes away before the full vision, the full idea of this grand masjid can take place. And although, yes, most likely when it was built, it was bigger and more grand than the Hagia Sophia, because of earthquakes and some fires that happened, a large part of it was burnt down, and the universities and this libraries and the research facilities that were there, they were sort of destroyed. And now really you can just see the masjid, but still a beautiful masjid. And when you go to that place in Fatih, there's a sort of serenity and peace that you feel there. In this world nowadays, obviously in London, everyone is in a rush to go from somewhere to somewhere. Nobody has time. You ask someone, I'm busy. People will salam alaikum, salam. Before the imam even finished this salam, they've gotten up and they've already run at the mosque, right? So if you go to Istanbul, this Fatih, the place, you see that the people there, there's a lot of peace and serenity in that place. There's no rush. People are just there. I think this is testament to the barakah of this great man, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. And obviously he also invests in the infrastructure of the empire. And now, towards the end of his life, in the final year of his life, in 1481, he embarks on a final campaign. And the destination of this campaign is not certain. It was a secret. He never told anyone where he was marching towards. Maybe obviously his closest viziers, but publicly this knowledge was not known where he was marching. He was marching to eastwards. And so there's three possible places he could have gone to attack. Either the Mamluks, which was the most reasonable, or the Achaemenid who we spoke about before, whatever remnants was left of them, or the early Safavids, who were a Shia, new emerging Shia power in the east. So it could have been one of those three. Most likely it's the Mamluks. Why was he attacking the Mamluks, another power, another sultanate? Because they were a thorn in the side of the Ottomans. They helped the Karamanids when they attacked the Ottomans, and they were also making alliances with the Europeans, who were the enemies of Sultan Muhammad Al Fatih. So he knows he can't allow this scheming to go unpunished, and so most likely it was that he was marching towards the Mamluk Sultanate. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destined it to be that whilst on this campaign, he falls really, really ill, and still in his own empire, in his own domain, he passes away. Now, there are some rumors that he was poisoned by the Venetians or something like that, but they're not very, very strong. They're not very accurate. And most likely it is that he became really, really unwell and he passes away in May 1481. And really, just try to understand this. A man who could have lived like a king. He was a king. He was a sultan. He could have lived like that, right? He could have lived in the comforts of his own palace. But where does he die? He doesn't die in the palaces that he was raised up in. He dies on the battlefield. He dies in his tent, in the grass on a battlefield, on his way to continue to expand the empire and the power of the Muslims, to unite the Muslims under one banner. That was his life's mission. He understood that time is very short and the things to achieve are a lot. And that's why he doesn't waste time. He's always going somewhere. He's always on a military campaign, or he's always inspecting his army. Now he's always trying to fix the system of law, or trying to fix this or tweak that, or make sure this is being taken care of, making sure the poor people are being all of this was his main concern. And that's why he spent more time outside of his own capital city than he did inside his own capital city. He laid the foundations for all these conquests that his sons and his grandsons would go on to achieve. And that's why, really, that he left behind such an enduring legacy. Like, it's been how many? Over 500 years, nearly 600 years since he passed away. But to this day, tens of millions of Muslims still remember his name because of the things he achieved. And really, that's what we need to take away from his life. That it's all about what you leave behind. That's what lasts. You are going to die. Death, we don't know when it will come to anyone. It can come to anyone at any point. They say death has no age, right? It has no selection process. It doesn't choose this person or distinguish between that person. It's decreed time. It will come to you. So you need to act now to leave behind a legacy, something that will ensure that long after you have become, your bones have melted away in the grave, and there's nothing, no remnant left of you, no physical remnant left of you on this earth. You need to ensure that there is still something that continues. Look at him. To this day, Istanbul is a Muslim country, Muslim city. Turkey is a Muslim country because of the efforts of this man. Islam spread, me and you. If you look around right now, the person to your right, the person to your left, they are Muslim here in the UK as a direct result of the efforts of this man. He ensured through his efforts that Islam penetrated into the deepest and westernmost parts of Europe. And that's what I always say. If you want to look at his legacy, you don't have to go, although I'd recommend you go to Istanbul, you don't have to. You just look at the Muslim next to you on your right and on your left. That is his legacy. And that's what me and you need to understand, that we also need to leave behind a legacy, something that ensures that our names, obviously we don't do it so our names are remembered for glory, but we do it so that the good deeds continue. And we hope that all the good actions that we are doing, he will receive a portion of that too, because of the efforts that he went to. And so that's the story of Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, rahimahullah. And what happens afterwards, very briefly, is that the sort of his son takes over, Sultan Bayezid, who rules for a few decades. There isn't much expansion during his time, but it's really his grandson, Sultan Selim I, and Sultan Suleiman I, who now usher in a golden age of the Ottoman Empire. But why? Again, all because of the direct efforts of this one man, Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. And that's why he's a man that is worth memorializing, worth remembering, worth speaking about. He's a hero for us, right? He achieved so much. Why do we not know about him? Why should we not go and tell his story to everyone else? Right? Go tell the people around you, your family, your friends, about the story of this great man who, because of his efforts, me and you are Muslim here today. Imagine he was here today, a man as grandiose and as brave and courageous like Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih. Maybe our ummah wouldn't be going through the struggles that he is going through today if a man like him was alive. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy on Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih, accept all his efforts and the efforts of his family, because remember, it wasn't just him, it wasn't a one-man show. Yes, he was the main figure. It was people around him supporting him, his grand viziers, his teachers, his children, his mothers, his wives, all of these people helped him. It was an effort together to build this empire and make the Ottoman Empire so strong. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy on all of them, on Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih himself, his ancestors and his successors. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant the ummah strength through someone like Sultan Mohamed Al Fatih once again. Are there any questions from anything? Is that all right? Okay, then we'll leave it there inshallah. Thank you very much. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barik ala sayyidina wa maulana wa nabiyyina wa habibina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.